So this was actually something we wanted to talk about last week, but we didn't have time. We possibly do have time this week. And basically, CD Projekt Red was reflecting on the launch of Cyberpunk 2077, came up with comments such as it became cool to dislike the game, and the comms boss basically said Cyberpunk at launch was way better than it was received. Man, there's a lot to dig into on this one, John. I mean, but it is essentially a game of two halves, right? Which is to say that if you are running on a last gen console, I think it's safe to say that launch experience was trash. However, if you were running on a decent spec PC, it was buggy but not game breaking in any way, and they did improve it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this before recently, and I did have people come back and say, "Yeah, well, I had plenty of bugs and issues on there, but whether it was game breaking or not, I think is up for debate." And maybe some of them were, but it was kind of like it launched in a buggy state, yeah. But I think on PC it was quite playable from the beginning. I finished the whole thing pre-launch. I mean, imagine playing pre-launch Cyberpunk after the way it was received. I think it turned out pretty good in that sense. And I didn't actually personally encounter too many glitches, but others did for sure. But I don't think it necessarily ruined. Yeah, it's all, again, it's this community stuff bleeding in. I can only really speak to my own experience, but yeah. But then the console versions came in. And it has been said that they didn't show them off before launch, and that's not entirely true. They did actually produce a video showing all console versions of the game, but obviously that was moderately cherry-picked, shall we say. And the result is that the end game, I remember the sinking feeling I had, actually. I'd played through most of the game on PC. The console version came in. I eagerly downloaded it, and I remember loading it up and just feeling like, oh no. Like it almost killed the buzz I was having around the game. It was that jarring. It just looked so much worse. The technical problems became so much more obvious. Things just didn't feel right. It was, you could tell that there was a serious problem with this game on the consoles. And then we saw it like on Xbox One and a base PS4, and you're just like, this feels like, Skyrim did it on the PS3, that kind of thing. It's real bad. And so I do think that colored it. And I do think that they were, I think Sony blocking it from the store like they did, basically pulling it down, kind of makes sense given how bad the state is. But I don't think there was really, I don't think they had a choice, and that's what sucks about this, right? They've invested so much money into it at this point. They promised it for so long to these machines. They had that marketing deal for like Xbox One X that had the custom One X system, right? But at the same time, it's not possible to only release it for those pro machines either, right? It needed to be on the last gen systems. They needed to recoup that cost. I'm sure none of the developers were happy with how it launched on those machines. They wanted it to be better. I'm sure they knew damn well that it was a mess there.
Well,
right?
Yeah. I feel like the pulling it from the store thing is always weird for me, because Sony shouldn't have needed to pull it from the store if they just denied it certification, and Xbox should have also denied its certification given the amount of crashes and the other technical performance issues that the game had. Like what is that about? You don't pull the game from a store if it shouldn't be there.
This
anyway.
sort of like, I think, changed some policies at those companies, because from what I understand, for very big publishers, they almost could get the equivalent. And this is just what I've heard talking to people, that they can actually almost get a waiver on this stuff, where they'll be like, we found these bugs, you need to fix this stuff. And then it's like, it's a big game, big publisher, very well known. They're like, well, okay, we have this patch coming. It's going to fix this stuff. Don't worry. Right. And they kind of foolishly, I would say, let it through, assuming that patch is going to come and it's going to fix these problems and they're good to go. They're not going to, delay the biggest game of the year over that. And then it actually comes out and it has major problems, and the patch didn't fix anywhere near enough things. And now they're in this bad situation. And that's also, that fault is also on the console manufacturer for letting it through, right? They should have pushed back harder rather than giving them this sort of like this waiver like they did. And I suspect going forward, that kind of thing isn't going to happen as much. Although I say that we've seen the state of a lot of games lately. It's also also not great. So I don't even know anymore at this point.
I mean, I'm just thinking about Tom's Golem review right now. That is
that's much worse. That's so much worse.
That's a smaller game, like it's a smaller game. It's
how did that get through? Jesus.
I don't know. Look, maybe certification is something different these days than it was before.
In theory, if a game crashes back to the front end, it should not be approved by the platform holder. That's one of the key technical requirements, that the game doesn't crash, right?
Yeah.
So if a game crashes, then there are problems with the procedure of actually checking the game. But I had crashing issues with Miles Morales when it launched. So intermittent bugs are one thing, but games like Golem and Cyberpunk, you could actually easily reproduce them, and that is problematic.
I do want to say there is another side to this debate over how good the game was at launch, in that a lot of people still claim that there was missing features, and to a degree they're right, but my perspective on this is a little different, because depending on your source of what was going to be in the game, I think CD Projekt Red sort of made their own bed by giving certain interviews and saying via like text that, oh, we're going to have this in here. Like, people are obsessed with this police chase thing. Like,
I knew you were going to talk
about
that.
They just like, every time you say, I like Cyberpunk, they're like, yeah, but it doesn't have police chases. This game sucks. I want my police chases. It's like, what is the obsession with police chases? Go play Need for Speed Unbound. Trust me, you'll get your police chases. I agree though that if they said it was going to be there, it should have been there. Although in that case, I do think people still react to you. They just don't get in the cars and chase you around. But other things like Alex and you guys as well. But I got to attend every single pre-release presentation for Cyberpunk at trade shows. I saw how they presented the game to us before launch, and they delivered on 95% of what was in every single one of those demos. There's just a few things missing, like the wall climbing, or like, I guess you could like,
that stick yourself to the wall with those
blades.
Blades
that was cut, and there's a few other little things like that. But at the same time, it also got better in other ways, like all the ray tracing stuff. None of that was in those demos, right? The game looked significantly better in the end. But in terms of the actual flow of the missions, what they showed in those demos was exactly what we really got in the final game, save for a couple of those minor features like the wall hanging. And so that was my point of reference of like what I expected. But then again, you actually look back at some of the things they said in interviews, and it's a little bit more Peter Molyneux like, where you're like, oh, okay, you guys promised way too much. You should not have done that. So
I think your point from day one though, John, starting with that E3 presentation, was that you had no idea how they were going to get this to run on last gen consoles.
Yeah. I said that
and ultimately,
they kind of didn't.
That came to pass. Yeah.
It was, exactly. But I know people are going to be so mad at us for saying nice things about Cyberpunk. I know, I get it. I like this game. So, but, man, yeah, those last gen versions, they're just so unbelievably poor, but
just should never release there. Yeah.
From my perspective though, I was actually, and this is unfair to those players, I admit it, but I was actually happy to see what I felt like was a game built for PC gamers first and foremost, with consoles being kind of, secondary. Obviously, in terms of sales, they're not secondary. They're very important. But to me, this felt a bit like a Crisis in a way, or old school PC games, where games were coming out, they were pushing the PC platform, doing things that you wouldn't expect to see on consoles. And I think they did a great job with that. But again, the market has shifted, and you need to have a good console version, and they just did not at first. And even now, I think the console versions are perfectly fine, but they're still just nowhere near as impactful as playing it on a good PC. Like, it's not even close.
You don't even need a good PC at this point.
Yeah, I mean, a mid-range PC can do it.
Absolutely. The 4060 can do RT Overdrive. $300 GPU.
I know. I mean, I played the game on my PC at launch locked at 30 so that I could use all the ray tracing features with a gamepad, and it felt great. You know, even though it was 30, you know, I would have preferred higher frame rate, but whatever. It was still awesome looking. But now I'm able to play it at 120 frames per second with RT overdrive enabled, and it looks better than ever, and it runs like a dream. So that's pretty amazing. And they continue to support the game as they always do. I think if anything, most of the criticism that was warranted just comes from CD Projekt getting into the state where they were perhaps feeding into the hype cycle, misleading people with some of the interviews, and just the fact that the hype was so big that it could never live up to it. So there's going to be backlash. So I feel like the better response would have been somewhere in the middle. Like, I think people were a little bit too harsh on it, but also CD Projekt Red still messed up in a lot of ways. And it just created this nasty storm of like anger around the game.
Well, there was another sort of Lieutenant Frank Drebin moment where they were telling everyone the current gen console, or rather the current gen of the time, console versions were going to be absolutely fine, and there's this sort of raging inferno in the background of issues.
You say it's funny because prior, I think some months before launch, we had heard from someone kind of internally off the record that, oh man, these base console versions, especially Xbox One, it's running at like 8 FPS and it's completely broken. And we were like, oh boy, this is going to be a ride. And they obviously got it to run a lot better than that by launch, but only just.
Yeah, only just.
Man, okay, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting perspective, but they do seem to want to win back the trust of users, right? And I think that's the positive move forward. There is only going to be one expansion though for Cyberpunk, which is a bit disappointing, bearing in mind what they've done with titles like The Witcher 3, right? Which seem to enjoy a much bigger degree of support.
2 DLC packs, right? And one of them basically, which was really good, it takes place in the same world as the main game, and then the second one obviously goes to Toussaint, which is its own gigantic map, which is pretty awesome. Although, speaking of glitches, I'm still playing through The Witcher 3. I finished everything except for the Toussaint region, and I've been playing it on console and PC thanks to the cross save. The freaking Toussaint area is still has graphical glitches that have never been fixed since this next gen upgrade.
On all systems?
Yeah, from what I've seen. The main thing is the clouds flicker in a weird way. Like you can see them sort of flicker on and off at points. It's really weird and distracting. And also the way the foliage behaves is weird. Like this happened normally, but it happens a lot more here where you're running along and you'll see a patch of foliage and it just suddenly changed to a completely different patch of foliage with a different arrangement. And it just happens kind of around you as you're running, and it looks very glitchy. None of this stuff happens in this way in the main game or in the main region, but Toussaint seems to have some issues. Which is a bummer.
I don't recall that in the original release.
No, it was not. It was not in the original. This only happened after the next gen patch.
One thing I've always bummed about is how just they didn't really work on the CPU performance at all much on PC there still, and also there are some graphical bugs on PC, but I'm just kind of floored that they introduced shader compilation stutter, and you can totally find it. When I load up the game, I always load up Toussaint. I run from one area into a village, and the amount of shader compilation stutters on the way there is just so awfully huge on massive PCs even. I have no idea what they're doing. I mean, it's hard to get all those shaders for such a big open world game, but my God, you're releasing the game again, and Cyberpunk has 0. Cyberpunk is one of the best games.
Well, honestly, it's funny that Cyberpunk with RT Overdrive still is way more optimized and smoother running than The Witcher 3 with its next gen update.
It runs better.
It runs a lot better.
Crazy.